Thanks, Calum Chace, for joining me today. Calum, would you mind doing us a bit of a kind of background about yourself and how you came into talking about AI and talking about the future and singularity and those sorts of things?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me on the show. I have been thinking about artificial intelligence most of my life because I read lots of science fiction when I was growing up and since. And I started thinking about it particularly after I read one of Kurzweil's books. I think I've got that in common with a lot of people. The one that woke me up was Are We Spiritual Machines in 1999. And the reason why that woke me up is I'd always thought that there would be machines that were smarter than humans. And I think I'd read quite a few stories where the machines combined with humans, and that seemed like a good plan. But I always assumed that it would be centuries or thousands of years away. And Kurzweil's book made me think, wow, this might happen in my lifetime or the next generation's lifetime. And that was a really striking thought. Back in those days, the web wasn't really in full flow. In fact, back in those days, that's right. It was early days, and even the internet was pretty sparse.
Yeah.
So you couldn't find information very easily, and it's really remarkable how that's totally changed. It's one of those changes that we've all just taken for granted, but it's quite staggering the way that you can find stuff out now.
I think we're both of the generation that we kind of lived through that change, and that's a staggering thing for us to remember before the internet and those sorts of things. So
yeah, that's right. Well, I first saw the web in '94 when a large publishing company that I was consulting to said, "Take a look at this because we think it might be significant." And I thought, my first thought was, "Yeah, you're right. That's going to change everything." But it took quite a while to do it, obviously. And then the dot-com boom was happening in '99.
Yeah.
But still, in those days, it was still not easier to get hold of all sorts of niche information, whereas now it is. Anyway, so for the last 15 years or so, I've been, I think it's fair to say, fairly obsessed by the idea of artificial intelligence and where it's taking us. And I have got lots of friends that I talk to about it, and most of them have thought most of the time that I'm a blithering idiot. But then suddenly last year, when Nick Bostrom's book Superintelligence became well known and was read by some influential people, suddenly the world woke up because Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, Elon Musk started talking about the possible downsides, and the media. Well, actually, that's unfair. They were talking about. They actually expressed the prospects in very balanced terms, saying that it could be the best thing or the worst thing ever. But the media, understandably, only heard the downside and ran lots of pictures of the Terminator.
Yep.
And so suddenly, in the last year or two, my friends don't think I'm quite so batty after all, and the world is slowly waking up. So it's a fascinating time to be around and to be talking about it.
Yeah, and I think that book in particular is quite a sobering one. It's got a lot of factual graphs and things like that, as well as postulating on things that different ways of how these AI could transform, and also how it could come about, and at the speed at which it could come about, and all those sorts of things. So it's quite a tour de force of the whole kind of sphere, if you like, of the AI and what he's saying is super intelligent AI.
Yeah, it is. It's a remarkable book. Bostrom is one of the smartest people on the planet, and it shows in his writing. It's slightly heavy going, and some of it's a bit technical, but it's really worth reading. I think there's two books that anybody who's really interested in this space should read. One is that book, Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom, and the other is Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near. And if you read those two, you'll have a grasp on a lot of the argument. And of course, I have to plug my own.
Sure.
My book, Surviving AI, is probably more approachable and quicker to get through, and tries to cover a lot of the same ground.
I think that's a really good point for our listeners, because I've read the Singularity, Superintelligence, but I think I could have read some other slightly more approachable books to start off my interest. So if I was just coming to this and wanting a more kind of easy read to get me started and to get me interested in the whole arguments. I think would you say your book would have been kind of a better starting block book for people who haven't necessarily read into this subject, but
I think it's more accessible. It's written more for the layperson. Nick's book is it has the hallmarks of having been written by a professional philosopher, in that it's very thorough, very smart, and more slightly heavy going. Yeah, more academic
tone. Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the two books that you've currently got out and available on Amazon and other places?
Well, one of them is Surviving AI, which is a non-fiction review of a very brief review of the history of artificial intelligence, and then where it is now, how good it is now, and where it's going in the next few years. And I have a little fictional story, a day in the life of somebody who has got an artificial intelligence assistant, kind of a supercharged Siri, and the Internet of Things is becoming pretty powerful, and virtual reality, video conferencing is happening. So it's a picture of a world, say 10 or 15 years hence. But the book talks about the two singularities that I think are coming. Everybody talks about the technological singularity, which is when we get super intelligence. Oh, and actually, the singularity is a concept which can mean different things to different people. For me, I think of it as being the time when artificial general intelligence arrives. So an AI which can do all of the things cognitively that we can. It quickly becomes a super intelligence. And at that point, you pass through an event horizon, because the future is really hard to foresee. It's very hard to see what's going to happen the other side of that event horizon. So that's the technological singularity, which has interested a lot of people for some time.
Yep.
Before that, we're going to get what I call an economic singularity, which is when machine intelligence replaces most humans in jobs. When a machine can do your job, when it's got the capability, it very quickly will, because it will be quickly able to do it cheaper, better, and faster than you can. And it's an open question at the moment as to whether that machine intelligence automation will mean people can't do paid jobs, or whether we'll think of new jobs for people to do, which for some reason the machines won't be able to do. Now, the book Surviving AI doesn't talk very much about that. It sketches that scenario and then goes into much more detail on the superintelligence and technological singularity. I'm currently working on another book which will be called The Economic Singularity, which focuses squarely on that business of machine intelligence automation. Because although a lot of people are now talking about this, I think we haven't done nearly enough thinking about what kind of an economy we'll need if and when machines do replace humans in jobs, and I think they will.
Do you think? I mean, I love this question because you have the lots of kind of different ways of tackling this issue within the structures that we already kind of have. So, how are we going to take capitalism or this kind of post-social idea and then go further and tack these things on? How are we going to allow people to carry on working or allow them to have a basic income, for example? Do you see any way of this? So these jobs are going to get taken, and do you see any way of us kind of getting out of this capitalist kind of social structure and maybe going into something where the economics of it means that we don't really need to have money, for example? We don't need to lean on these pillars of industrialization so much.
I think we will need a new economy. I'm probably a rarity in what you might call the futurist community, in that I'm a fan of capitalism. I think the market economy, and broadly speaking capitalism with regulation, has produced marvelous results for humanity. Today is the best time ever to be born, particularly if you're born in one of the developed economies. It is, I think, undeniably true that that humanity's never had it so good, and the market economy is a big part of the reason why. But the market is excellent at dealing with economics of scarcity, and we are hopefully moving towards a different kind of economics, an economics of abundance. That's if we get it right.
Sure.
I think if we get to the point when a large minority or a majority of people can no longer do paid work because nothing they can do can't be done, nothing that they could do for money can't be done better, cheaper and faster by machines.
Yep.
We will at the very least need a universal basic income. But I don't think that's enough. A universal basic income could be a way of adjusting capitalism to deal with automation.
Sure.
But if we get it right, then lots of goods and services will become so cheap they'll be virtually free because they're automated and the investment in the robots and the machines can be quickly amortized. And then the market economy becomes perhaps irrelevant or perhaps dangerous, and we will probably need a new type of economy, and we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
The models that we have at the moment, like socialism, communism, feudalism, and any other type of economy we've tried, are almost certainly not going to work. So we've got some thinking to do.
I read this book called Down and Out in the Magical Kingdom, which is another science fiction book. And in that, the economy is run on kudos almost. It's how you're giving back and how socially active you are, or how the things that you make are being received. So you're building up these kind of kudos points. So you don't get money, but you do spend your kudos in a similar fashion. And I like that idea because it's totally different but very familiar sort of thing.
I hate that idea.
Do you? Okay.
I do, yeah. And in fact, it's being trialled in China at the moment.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, there's a thing, I forget what they call the overall thing, but they are they're piloting a system in which every bit of financial information that the state has on citizens is put into a pot, and added to that pot are people's behavior as rated by other people. And one of the big organizations which is trialing this is a company called Sesame, which is part of Alibaba, which is China's answer to Amazon.
Yeah.
It's a terrifying idea because having all of us rate each other leads very quickly to a big brother state on steroids. If you are at all challenging to the state or to a decent number of individuals, you get downvoted.
Sure.
And often the most interesting people are the people who get downvoted. But for anybody, it could be quite disastrous. And for a totalitarian society like China, it's capitalist, but it is totalitarian. To be introducing a system like that is really quite horrifying. It's the East German state gone mad.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's similar to the. So I'm amazed to hear that they're actually trialing it, because it seems to me that it's one of those things which, like the rules of robotics, the 3 rules of robotics. It's something that you can look at and discuss, but then through this book and through the robots stories, it kind of unravels, if you like. So I think trialing these things in science fiction, in simulation, in all these different ways is fantastic. But actually putting it to work in the real world is fantastic that they made that step and quite disastrous maybe as well, like you were saying.
Well, yeah, doing experiments in societies is quite dangerous. Because if you get it wrong, you can have very bad outcomes for a lot of people for a long time. Yeah. So I think this Sesame thing is it's a forerunner of disaster. There's an interesting, different but parallel system being allegedly being launched in the States called People, P-E-E-P-L-E, in which all of us are invited to rate each other. Now, the idea was to try to raise the standards of civilized behavior, which online, apart from anything else, could be a very good idea. But in the real world as well. And it ran into a storm of flack, the founders, because people didn't like the idea of being downvoted by other people. And they had to pivot it, as they say. They had to adapt it so that you wouldn't that downvotes, you could veto a downvote about you appearing on the site. Right. Now, of course, that may well make the whole thing a bit pointless.
Yeah.
Sure. And again, I think it shows that people can be quite quick to understand some of the downsides. I completely agree with you about science fiction being a great way to do thought experiments in what could happen. And that's why I wrote my other book, which is already published, which is called Pandora's Brain, which is a thriller about the arrival of the first superintelligence. Yeah,
and I mean, I've read a couple of books, with the Terminator style ending, where you have the machines which are ambivalent to humans and maybe start taking over. Is your book more on the side of machines are good or bad, or is it sobering kind of look at all the different eventualities that we could have, varying outcomes from having a super intelligent artificial being?
Pandora's Brain has a good super intelligence in it, a super intelligence which is very well disposed towards humanity. I really didn't want to write yet another Terminator Dystopia.
Sure. I think that's unusual. Definitely.
Yeah, quite, and it's actually surprisingly hard to do. But it does explore all the ways that things could go wrong, and the way that humanity reacts to the arrival of the superintelligence shows that it really throws into highlight the possible downside.
Yeah, and I think it's really fantastic that this book has a positive outlook, because sometimes people are restricted by the culture that surrounds them, and they can only see that this thing could be bad, and they don't see that this thing could be good, in equal respects, or that there's other opportunities within any particular kind of scenario, if you like. And I think AI is definitely one of those, which has had lots and lots of bad cultural artifacts written about it, which has not held it back necessarily, but definitely in the social psyche. I would say.
And for good reasons. It is a basic fact of writing fiction that you have to have jeopardy. Your hero or heroine has to go through a hard time. In fact, I was reading the other day that what you should do with your hero or heroine is torture them as much as possible, and then figure out a way to make it worse. Otherwise, you haven't got a story. So it's pretty inevitable that fiction written about AI, which is a very powerful technology, will give your hero or heroine a very hard time indeed.
So what we're really looking forward to is a story about the birth of AI, which is a non-story. So we discovered superintelligence, and it was great. The end.
Exactly. Well, I've tried to write something a bit more interesting than that.
Yes, sure. But I mean, in reality, that's kind of that would be the ideal, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need balance. There are massive risks in AI, in both of the singularities in particular, but it's coming anyway. We're going to have it, so we have to make the best of it. And if we are successful in navigating both of the singularities, our future is astonishingly good.
Yeah, I mean, it's if you read the next book about superintelligence, it goes on to say that it could be, a huge leap forward in how humanity not only operates, but I guess biologically, we could get rid of aging or viruses, or it could help us do all sorts of leaps in technological improvement to everyone's lives, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's right. And one of the most celebrated AI researchers, Demis Hassabis, one of the co-founders of DeepMind, has a great saying. He says that humanity's plan for the future should be 2 steps. The first step is solve intelligence, i.e. create an AGI, and the second step is to use that to solve everything else. And by everything else, he really means everything else, including climate change, including death, including aging, poverty, war, the whole lot. If we have a hugely powerful superintelligence, we most of our current problems should disappear. No doubt it would give us a whole bunch of new problems, but they'd be more interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the thought experiment there, which is somewhat connected to Nick Bonstrom's paperclip example, I guess, which we could go into maybe, but I mean, we could get to a point where we have a superintelligence, and it could say, well, we can get rid of war by doing X, and it might be that X is actually not palatable by human beings, or maybe not necessarily by the ideology or morals of those human beings at the time. So to end conflict, we have to give up television, or or we have to give up some civil liberties that we might have. Do you have any? I mean, is that something that you might think about, or you've seen?
Oh, for sure. The risks of a superintelligence getting it wrong, misunderstanding what humans meant when they said, for instance, improve human welfare as much as you can. Maybe we gave that as its goal, and it thinks, okay, well, crossing the road is pretty dangerous for you guys, so I'm going to lock you all into coffins and feed you the nutrients you need and the oxygen you need intravenously, and just keep you all very safe. And we'd hate that, but it might not get it.
But it'd be optimizing given that question that we've asked it.
Exactly. So the possibility of unexpected consequences is grave. The paperclip maximizer is a nice little cartoon that shows how a goal can look incredibly rational to start with, and then could have really horrible outcomes in real life. And that's one of the things that we need to be careful of. And that's a bigger danger than the Terminator Skynet sort of danger, because the chances of getting a purely malevolent AGI are probably not that great. I don't think you can dismiss them, but it's more the danger of the unexpected consequences.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
And well, I was just going to say, and that's why I am probably alone in thinking that the phrase that everybody talks about, ethics in AI, is the wrong word, because there are problems that we face well before we get to superintelligence, and possibly even after we get to superintelligence, which aren't about the ethics of a machine, because the machine may not be an entity capable of having ethics. What we're worried about is safety, both when, in the short term, for instance, with self-driving cars, the way we program a car to behave if there's an immediate prospect of an accident which could either kill a child or kill the driver. It's going to have to be programmed to make the decision one way or the other. That's a safety issue. It's not an ethics issue. The car doesn't have ethics.
I use your safety example synonymously with ethics, because the human being whose safety is in jeopardy has moral or ethical understanding. So I think I use the autonomous vehicles because it's a great example, and it's something that is happening now, and is it's not in the far-flung future. It's something which is in the news, And I think the example I usually give is, is the vehicle going to recognise your cat? Is it going to recognise your siblings? Is it going to recognise your family? And what decisions is it going to make about some sort of impact if it's out of control with those things? Is it going to end up running over loads of cats? And is that morally fine? Because I'm again talking about the human being's morals. And if it runs over the president or your mum, what are the differences? What are we literally going to program which has a moral impact? But it's to do with safety. It's to do with impacting on our lives, because, like you say, the machines don't necessarily currently have a conscious moral component, if you like.
No, they don't, and they probably won't for quite some time. So that's why I just think ethics is the wrong word. What we're concerned about is the safety of the machine, so that the machine makes decisions which maximise human safety. There is an ethical consideration for the person who programs the rules into the car. That's ethics, but very often it's just purely about safety.
Sure. So you would say that if I sat down and programmed one of these algorithms to run on a car, which is autonomous and it's going to run itself, I might have some morals that I have to make a decision on when I'm programming that car.
Yeah, at the moment, a driver is often forced with an ethical decision to make, although sometimes, obviously, the events happen too fast for the driver to be able to make that decision, where a machine could make the decision. So somewhere along the production process, and really it's in the programming of the instructions, an ethical decision is going to have to be made, which will determine the safety of the machine.
Yeah. I mean, given you've got it might be a long time ago now, but you have a a degree in philosophy. Do you think that having that experience, you can say something about those moral choices? Or, I mean, we always talk about having no real decision on ethics and morals, really. We all have our own kind of different morals, and there's different schools of thought on morality and ethical decision making. Do you think we're going to have to get to the point where we have to make a concrete decision, which could change, but I mean are more universal, a bit more like human rights in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to have to make lots and lots of decisions about safety, which will often have ethical components. And philosophers are trained in thinking about those things. That doesn't mean necessarily that they are the ultimate authorities on them, but no. Smart philosophers can help us think through those sorts of decisions. Of course, philosophers, like everybody else, disagree with each other, so there's not usually one authority that you can turn to, unfortunately. And we're going to have to make loads and loads of decisions. Self-driving cars will bring up lots of decisions. The opportunity to have killer robots, which is clearly on its way
in war zones, not
war
just
zones
in your house.
Yeah, well, yes, quite. Yeah, exterminating your children, or your neighbours. That's an area where we're going to have to make a lot of tricky decisions, and looking a bit further ahead, how we respond to the likelihood of lots and lots of people becoming unemployed. We're going to need to make some tricky decisions there too.
Yeah. All extremely interesting, valid, and scary, I guess, in equal measure. So we have this saying called Moore's Law. I don't know if you saw this recently in the news, or be it the more kind of underground technology news, but the people are starting to say that Moore's Law is coming to not a plateau necessarily, but is breaking. It's coming to its extent. It can no longer cope with the rate of improvement that we've had for the last 30 years. Yeah,
well, strictly speaking, Moore's Law has been dead for a while. If you interpret it to mean the particular phenomenon that Gordon Moore noticed back in 1956, we're not able to stack lots and lots more transistors on the chip at the same rate as we were, and particularly the clock speeds aren't increasing at the same rate they were. However, computers are still more or less doubling in their processing power. That's a tricky thing to measure, but they are still doubling in their capability per pound of value every 18 months to 2 years. Now, most people seem to think that something like that is going to carry on happening for about 10 years, and beyond that, maybe not. There are lots of new technologies coming along which may well keep it going. Mm-hmm. It's hard to make 3D stacks of chips rather than 2D, because either you have to print one on top of the other, in which case you're likely to fry the one underneath, or you have to print them separately and then attach lots of wires between them, which is tricky. Yeah, but people think they have found ways to do it. Obviously, quantum computing is a huge step, which is probably coming, but it's probably quite a long way into the future. At the moment, people are gravitating from CPUs to GPUs, which are more powerful for parallel processing, and chips are being designed for specific purposes, particularly for mobiles, as opposed to being general purpose, which is what they always used to be. And that's keeping some sort of a Baudelarized form of Moore's Law going at the moment. Now, people argue about this up and down, and it becomes a bit theological, frankly.
Yep.
But broadly speaking, computers are still improving at an exponential rate. Not everybody would agree with that, but that's broadly true. And it means, what it means in the real world is that deep learning and other machine intelligence techniques are going to continue to provide astonishing capabilities, which will mean that most people won't be doing paid jobs in 20 to 30 years because the machines will do them better. Now, that progress may grind to a halt, but that's not an immediate prospect, and it doesn't seem very likely.
Yeah, I mean, we can see this all around us with all sorts of people's jobs getting usurped by Amazon or delivery services delivering food straight to your door when there could have been lots of other people in that chain. We are effectively optimizing ourselves, I think, almost by using this tool.
I think we're really at the early stages. I don't think we're really seeing much machine intelligence automation yet. Automation's been going on since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and before.
Yeah. And the Luddites had something to say about that at the time.
Yeah. But new jobs were invented, new forms of old jobs were invented, and it didn't lead to long-term secular unemployment. What actually happened was economic activity increased, wealth increased, and that led to more jobs and more wealth. Yeah. It may be different this time. I think it is different this time because this time the machines are replacing our brain capabilities, not just our sort of manual labour capabilities. But I don't think we're really starting to see it yet. 2015 was a tipping point year because deep learning techniques enabled machines to get almost as good as us at image recognition and speech recognition and natural language processing. But the real-world applications of those haven't really taken off yet. They will in the next few years, and that's when we're going to really start seeing it happening.
Yeah. I mean, for me, those things are pieces of the puzzle. You put all these pieces together and you actually get something quite interesting. Individually, they are, not basic, but quite separate, quite isolated.
Yeah.
I think, so we've got a little bit of time left, I think, if you're okay for time.
Sure.
So I think in the singularity kind of outcome, the question might be, how is there anything we can do? How can we move forward towards a good outcome? How can we make machines help us make the statistics work in our favour, if you like?
Well, the two singularities are different. The economic singularity requires different solutions to the technological singularity, but they both require the application of a lot of our talent. So I think the first step is for as many people as possible to become aware of what's coming down the road and the scale of the challenge, the scale of the opportunity, because as I say, in both of them, it could be really great outcomes if we get it right. So with economic singularity, we need to be watching carefully to see whether machine intelligence automation does throw people out of work permanently, or whether we do succeed in creating new jobs or varieties on existing jobs which the machines can't do. It seems to me unlikely, but it's unproven at the moment. So we need to be watching carefully for that. And I think the other thing we need to be doing is to do thought experiments with different types of economies. Because one of the things that's obvious is, let's say most people can't work or can't do paid jobs, and we all get paid a universal basic income. That's fine, but what it means is that unless we change the economic system, most of us are living at the benevolence of the small number of people who own everything. And those people are called Larry Page, Sergey Brin, and Mark Zuckerberg, because AI is the juice in all value creation in 20 or 30 years, and they and people like them will own it. And a world where the rest of us live off their generosity is pretty dangerous, particularly because they will have privileged access to a constant flow of technologies which will enhance them cognitively and physically, and at a really rapid rate. Every week some amazing new thing will be made available, and they'll have privileged access to it. They will quickly become a different species. Now that's very serious. Because having
what can we do about this? This kind of bleak kind of totalitarian sort of environment. Is there something that we could get involved with ourselves now? Is it a politician's issue, or is it a grassroots movement?
I think all we can do at the moment is think about it, study it, and work out what the potential options are. And we've got time. We've got 2 or 3 decades before this stuff happens. I don't think anybody's got any solutions yet. I certainly haven't seen anybody come up with a blueprint of how we get from here. Well, what the new economy looks like and how we get from here to there. I think that those are the sorts of questions we need to be thinking about. But we are 7 billion smart little mammals, and I think we need to apply quite a few of our best brains to these problems. So the first step is to get everybody thinking about it, and the second step is to monitor and do scenario planning about the future. The other singularity, the technological singularity, is a longer-term project, and work has already started on that. And there are two broad approaches to solving the problem of how you make sure a superintelligence is good for us rather than bad for us. Yep. One is you control it after it exists. That strikes me as being impossible, or at least very hard, because you're trying to control something which is much smarter than you. The other is you set its motivation structure up before it arrives, such that it will only want good things for us, and it will be very diligent about working out what is really, really good for us. And that strikes me as being a more fruitful line of attack. And there are 4 organizations already working on that.
Sure.
So, we've started. There's a lot more work to do, but it's a generational project.
I think that's a really interesting point. And in my mind, when I think about that sort of, there's a conscious artificial being that we've kind of created or semi-brought into existence, and it's probably helped itself along that route somewhere. The example I always talk to people about is if you give it some sort of motivation, like reproduction or feeding on different sorts of electronics, or in some way, or having to feel good about itself by other means, or by doing things it feels good about itself, then you're almost kind of encouraging it to reproduce. You're encouraging it to have these goals, which inherently these machines or the algorithms don't actually have, which is part of what separates us in biology, I guess. So we are trapped in this instinctual cycle of having to reproduce and eat and have oxygen and all sorts of stuff. So, I mean, are you worried that? For myself, I'm a little bit worried that if we give the means of reproduction to a machine and the want or the need to do it, that will encourage it to do lots of other things, lots of other strange behaviours that we are accustomed to, like war and famine and all sorts of other stuff.
It's very hard to guess in advance what the motivational set of the superintelligence will be. We will try to constrain it, and hopefully those constraints will survive. I think that's the best we can do. Once it becomes millions of times smarter than us, its motivations will probably be as obscure to an unaugmented human as the motivations of a human are to a dog. A dog looks at a human and thinks, "You're such an alpha dog. I bet you've got a lot of really interesting bones buried in all sorts of interesting places." And that's probably as far as it gets in thinking about what we do and what we're about. There's a lot more